is it?
It's a grand, exciting start. All right. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And let us study Talmud.
Woo!
That's right. All right. So we took a brief break from where we were generally going through, which was Tractate Brachot. We've been not word for word or line by line, but going through ideas in Tractate Brachot. The last 2 weeks, we went off because of the, as we call it, Yana de Yoma. We focused on ideas relating to the time of year. So 2 weeks ago, Thursday was a couple of days before Tisha B'Av. So we spoke, actually for 2 weeks. For 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago, we spoke about the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai and the destruction of the temple and the city of Beitar. Yavne, that is. Last week was the 15th of Av, or the eve of the 15th of Av, which was a... we didn't really speak about this. I mean, you're right. Destruction of Beitar was Tisha B'Av, but we didn't get to that discussion in the Talmud. We, in our class, didn't get to it. And then last week, we focused on the story or the stories of the 15th of Av, which makes it so festive. And this week, we go back to the Talmud, which we were generally discussing, the Talmud Tractate Brachot, which is, on the one hand, it is Agadita, which is, it's not from the more complex analytical elements of the Talmud, but on the other hand, it's very practical stuff. It talks about things which we are very much part of our everyday Judaism. Specifically, we are talking now, and we will begin today, or I should say not begin with, but we're going to get to the importance of shul, the importance of davening in shul, the importance of davening along with the minyan, at the same time the minyan daven. So it's interesting stuff and practical stuff. But what I'm going to begin with, for those who are following along in the text, we are going to go to Brachot Zayin Amud Bey, 7b, at the very bottom of 7b. And the Gemara has been saying a series of statements said by one great sage in the name of another very great sage. And that's sometimes you'll find the Gemara seems to say ideas one after the other which are unrelated, and the only thing which connects them is the author, or is the one who said them. And that's that. This is the section of Gemara over here is like that. And the Gemara is going through numerous statements which were said by Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Yochanan, one of the great Talmudic sages, and Shimon Bar Yochai, who is well known as the author of the Zohar, as someone who is described as someone who studied Torah morning till night, especially for the 13 years that he was in a cave. All he did for those 13 years was study Torah. And he's someone who's known as Toraso Umnasa, which literally means, Toraso Umnasa means his Torah was his occupation. From morning till night, he studied Torah. And there are certain laws which are specifically geared to someone who's Toraso Umnasa. Someone who studies Torah morning to night and can say so confidently and accurately that they do that every day, morning till night, study Torah, they are exempt from all other commandments. There are no mitzvahs that they're obligated in because they're completely preoccupied with Torah study. And if you're involved in Torah study, you don't have to do anything. You really don't have to do any other obligations. You don't have to daven. Someone who is Toraso Umnasa does not have to daven. And what's that? I understand, but this is the Torah is one of the commandments. So there's this concept of a osek b'mitzvah patim in a mitzvah. If you're involved in one mitzvah, you're exempt from all other mitzvahs. This is brought down in other areas of halacha. For example, if someone is involved in a funeral, and they are necessary parts of the funeral. A person is actively involved in burying someone, which is a great mitzvah. As long as you are actively needed and involved in burial, you don't have to do any other mitzvahs. So if it's taking 5 hours and it encompasses the entire time to daven shachris, so that day you don't have an obligation to daven shachris.
It's funny because the only mitzvah that you have to interrupt anything for it is very simple.
Right. I mean, well, specifically a mace mitzvah. Right. Right, because you do have to interrupt to do that mitzvah because it's a mitzvah which if you don't do a mitzvah, there's a discussion. This is its own this topic. A mitzvah there's a mitzvah which comes up, which maybe you have to break what you're doing to do, and then there's the idea of a mitzvah that comes up, but others can do it, right. So then you may not have to break. So it's its own point. But the point is that someone like Rabbi Shneur who studies Torah morning till night, they are exempt from prayer. Now, most of us who don't study that amount. So therefore we say, look, you're going to take a break anyway, so may as well take a break to daven. Why am I saying this? Firstly, because it's interesting. But aside from that, all this makes the following statement of Shimon Yochai so counterintuitive. Shimon Yochai stood for the study of Torah. I'll give another example. How Shimon Yochai stood for the study of Torah. The Gemara says that you should study Torah morning and night. That's the Gemara, not the Gemara. The Torah says, you should study Torah morning to night. So the question which is raised is, well, how am I supposed to earn a livelihood? You know, if I'm studying Torah morning till night, how am I supposed to raise to earn a livelihood? Which brings to mind a very famous Jewish joke, which I feel obligated to say, even if you've already heard this. And that is about a person who is interviewing his prospective son-in-law. Somebody who's dating his daughter, wants to marry his daughter, and in the good old days, you have to ask permission. So he met with his parents-in-law, he's meeting his father-in-law, and his father-in-law starts asking him questions. Because this guy's a Torah scholar. So he says, you know, you're gonna get married and you're gonna have to buy a home. How are you gonna do that? So he says, you know, God will provide. So then he says, all right. Says then you're gonna, God willing, you hope to build a family. Of course, you have children, yes. So then, how are you gonna take care of the children? How are you gonna pay for their needs? Says God will provide. He says, and then education comes up, which is a significant amount. So he says, how are you gonna do that? He says, God will provide. So he goes. The meeting ends, and the father-in-law goes to his wife, the future mother-in-law, and she says, "No. What do you think of our daughter's future fiance? He says, I don't know much about him, but I like him because he already thinks I'm God. So the idea of how are you going to provide if you're studying Torah morning to night? So there's two answers in the Talmud. One answer is given by Rabbi Shneur. Rabbi Shneur says you could study Torah for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, and then you could work. And then you fulfill you fulfill the studying day and night because you studied a portion by day and a portion by night. In fact, that a person is supposed to study Torah every morning and every night. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says no. Shimon Bar Yochai says take the verse literally and learn day and night, which means all the time you're awake. And don't worry, somehow your work will be done by others. It'll work out. God will provide. And the Gemara says many people tried the approach of Shimon Bar Yochai and it didn't work out for them. And so therefore, it's understood that Rabbi Shmuel's approach is the more practical approach. That a person should designate time for study and then earn a living. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gave an approach which most people can't live up to. It's not because it's wrong. It's because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was talking about his standard. His standard of study was such that he had such a level of commitment to Torah that he felt it's almost like if you have that level of commitment and connection to Torah, it'll be taken care of. But most people don't have that standard. So again, Shimon Bar Yochai represents the absolute and ultimate commitment to Torah study, which again makes the following statement all the more interesting. Says Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Gedola shimusha shel Torah yoser milimuda. The shimush of Torah, which means the oh boy. How would I translate shimush of Torah? No, that's not what it means. Shimush of Torah means that it's more important to dedicate oneself to the assistance of their teacher than to actually study from their teacher. You want to know what's greater than studying Torah from your teacher? And over here, teacher means the rabbi or the rebbe. We're talking about the Talmudic times. The rebbe, the mentor. You're the one you turn to for guidance and for Torah wisdom. So you think the best thing is to just study from them, everything they teach to study. And he says, no, there's something better than studying their wisdom, and that is tending to them, being by their side, being their assistant in that which they do. Gadol shimusha shel Torah, the assistance to Torah, the assistance of Torah scholars, is greater than the study of Torah. And the question is why? What's the logic to this statement? Why is the assistance to a Torah scholar greater than the study of Torah? And before I share some of the commentaries on this, I'd like to open it up to the commentaries here in the room or virtually to share your thoughts on it. Okay, so Jeffrey says because it allows the scholar to study Torah. If you were taking care of cooking them breakfast, they don't have to cook their own breakfast. So therefore, it allows them to study Torah, which then enables the students to continue to study more.
You live it. You like embody it. You know, as opposed to like studying it on paper.
Okay, so then you embody the Torah by being by their side.
Yeah, you like
by assisting them.
In like a full, complete.
Well, with this,
Go ahead.
With this, also a person fulfilling two mitzvahs. By attending, they're still involved in the study of the Torah. And second is also helping and, service. Being of service is also another mitzvah. So two mitzvahs are done at the same time.
Beautiful. Okay, so Neil is suggesting that you have a double mitzvah of that you do study Torah and you're also assisting Torah scholars. Assisting anyone is a mitzvah. Certainly assisting a Torah scholar is a mitzvah, so it's a twofer. Okay? Okay, so Yaakov suggests that you see the midos. Instead of just learning the wisdom, you also gain from the midos, the character of the of a Torah scholar.
So, Rabbi.
Yep.
So we see this play out with Moshe and Aaron. Moshe and Yehoshua.
Okay, Moshe and Yehoshua. All right.
Yeah.
How so?
Actually, because he was always at his feet. He was always at his feet. And at the end, Hashem told him, give him your portion. Very
good. So you're saying, that's actually a very interesting point. Moshe is saying that you see this, an example of this, and it's interesting, the Gemara is going to share an example, and it's not Moshe Yeshua, it's another teacher student. But Moshe Yeshua, you see how the Torah actually says, Yeshua ben Nun lo yamush mitoch ha'al, was never missing from the tent of Moshe Rabbeinu. And when it comes to choosing the next leader, who is it? It's Yehoshua. So I think that's a very, very beautiful observation. And that is that Yehoshua is an example of this quality that you see that he, that when it describes Yeshua's commitment to Moshe, it describes it more as being there constantly. So much so that the example of perhaps the most extreme, extreme is a clear example of that is that when Moshe comes down from the mountain with the tablets, the Jews are sinning and Yeshua has no idea about it. There's this major party going on of dancing around the golden calf. Yeshua has no idea because he's just waiting for his teacher. He's waiting at the bottom of the mountain. Moshe says, what's going on? He says, I don't know. It's some sort of celebration. So yes, you're right. That's a beautiful example, but it still doesn't explain why though. Good. So that's a perfect dogma. That's an example. So we have different answers given as to why. And yes, Aristeo, did you want to share something?
Oh yeah, sure. Real quick. Just maybe on a more practical, less spiritual sense. If you have a Jewish employer, he'll be more sympathetic to like not only giving you Shabbat and holidays, but also making the work itself more about Torah, because there's a lot of Torah that can be learned like baderech, right. so to speak, like on the way of
a lot of Torah that can be underappreciated on the way. So I'm going to share what the commentaries say, and it encompasses a lot of the ideas that were shared. What I find interesting is that Al-Shich and the Chidushei Hagra, the Vilna Gaon, they have one approach. I think there's two very distinct understandings of this statement. And it's a practical area. It's a practical area of, this is not a mystical concept. So there's one understanding, which is that it's actually beneficial as part of one's study. That one gains more from in their studies by attending to their teacher than by just listening to their lectures. Even till today, for a person, there's what we call smicha, which we call rabbinic ordination. If someone wants to take it to the next level, beyond just smicha, which means one has a title rabbi, then one becomes a dayan, a judge. In order to take it to the next level, of not just being a rabbi, but being a dayan, a judge, and one has to go through a period of time of shimush. What does shimush mean? It's the same word over here, shimush. Shimush means internship. That's what it is. So many understand this as a form of internship, that you could study a lot in medical school, but when you walk around in the hospital with the doctor, that's when you learn more. That's the way many understand this statement. Is that not shimush over here means when you're there with them, alongside them, assisting them in the hospital room, or in the setting of practical halacha, you're going to gain more, because then questions are going to come up, and you're going to be able to refer back to not to the words in the Talmud, because let's be honest, the Shulchan Aruch and the Talmud, they don't necessarily address, or they necessarily don't address every scenario that comes up. So if all you know is just memorizing data and information, so when real life situations come up, when there's a conflict between people that comes in front of you, if there's a husband and wife that you need to try to bring peace between, which is, by the way, part of the work of a true Rav, a true rabbi is bring people together. It's going to be, if you just know information, it's going to be hard to resolve all sorts of situations. But if you have that shimush, which means you spent time by a proper Rav, by a proper leader, and you saw how they interact with people, and you saw how they applied Torah wisdom to real life scenarios, again, much like the internship, or much in all fields, specifically in the medical field, where you see how it's, you took from the abstract to the reality, so you will learn more by assisting and being there and attending and assisting someone who is a true Torah scholar. So that is one understanding of this, very practical approach, one understanding of this. A second approach takes a little bit more of a mystical approach, which is that there's a certain humility that comes from being an assistant to holiness, to greatness. That being, and certainly in Hasidic circles, I think there's this idea is certainly emphasized more. And that is when you come across someone who's a tzaddik, someone who is holy, someone who's righteous, there's a certain bittul, certain humility in recognizing and being a servant to that holiness and assisting. And in the Pirkei Avos, what's the word in Pirkei Avos? They have a misavek ba'afar raglehem. You should almost sit there in the dust of their feet. And it's basically saying that part of growth as a Jew, part of growth in Torah is the idea of humility and subservience. And yes, primarily that means subservience to God, but there's a certain subservience to holiness altogether. And if I come across a person who is holy, and if I come across a person who's clearly divine, so there should be a certain bittul, a certain humility, and a sense of what can I do to assist this person? And this is the second approach, that the shimusha, that the assistance and attending to someone who is holy brings about a certain bittul, a certain humility that is necessary in one's growth as a Jew. And that's the second approach, which is given by the commentaries on this Gemara. So either be that as it may, again, Rabbi Shneur shares something very interesting, which is that you think that studying from someone is the epitome of greatness, of receiving from that person. Often it is the one who is the shamish, the one who is attending and there assisting, that is actually gaining more for the reasons given earlier. All right, so this is part of the first. Now, what's the example that is given? Shenemar. So Moshe earlier said, the example would be Moshe and Yeshua, but the Gemara actually chooses a different example of a great teacher and disciple. And who is that? None other than the great Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, and Elisha and his disciple who was Elisha. So you have Elijah followed by Elisha. Eliyahu Hanavi, whose student is Elisha. Eliyahu Hanavi is perhaps more well known because he visits by every bris and he visits by every Pesach. But Elisha was also one of the great prophets of the Jewish people, and a miracle worker, a great miracle worker. What's the pasuk? So what does the pasuk Gemara says? Shenemar, where do we see this idea that shimusha is greater than learning? The pasuk states, Shenemar, and this is, if you want to know the source, this is in the book of Melachim, Kings 2, Melachim Beis, chapter 3, verse number 11. So there's two books of Melachim, Melachim Beis, Melachim Kings 2, chapter 3, verse number 11. In case you want to fact check me. So here's what it says. Shenemar, the pasuk says, Pay Elisha ben Shaphat. Here there is Elisha, the son of Shaphat, Asher, who, you want to know who Elisha is? Yatzak Mayim al Yidei Eliyahu, who poured water for Eliyahu. Here is Elisha, who poured water for Elijah. And in English, it sounds the same, Elisha, Elijah, but in Hebrew, it's Elisha, who poured water for Eliyahu. Says the Gemara. Lamad lo nemar. It doesn't say, here is Elisha, who studied from Eliyahu. If you wanted to talk about who you wonder who Elisha is, he was the prime student of Eliyahu. It doesn't say that. Instead, it says, who poured water? Ella Yatzak. Rather, when it wants to describe the greatness of Elisha, it says the one who poured water. Melamed. From here, you can derive that the assistance pouring water for Eliyahu is greater than the study of Torah. Now, it so happens that both the context of the verse, when was this verse stated, as well as the context of when the water was poured, are both part of very interesting stories. Now, you read the pasuk, oh, here is Elisha. You think it's maybe a conversation between two people on a park bench. They're talking about who's Elisha. Here's Elisha. Look, Elisha who poured water for Eliyahu. No, that's not what happened. The story in which this verse takes place is fascinating, and the episode in which he poured water for Eliyahu Navi is fascinating too. What are the two stories? So the story in which, when was it said? When was it said? Here is Elisha who poured water for Eliyahu Navi. So the story is like this. This is a very interesting alliance for a war. So as we spoke about actually last week, the Jewish people were divided right after the kingdom of Shlomo Melech, after King Solomon. And his Shlomo Melech was succeeded by his son Rechavam. And during the era of the kingdom of Rechavam, you have Yeravam dividing, going off with 10 of the tribes. They become the northern tribes of Israel. All right, so you have Rechavam and Yeravam. After that point, what becomes the relationship between the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel? So it's very fascinating over the course of time, a couple of hundred years. So you have, sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse. There was even a battle between them, and there's never any terrible war with many casualties. There's also war, but there were times where they worked together. And there was one such time which this happened, which is the context of this verse, and that was during the kingdom of Yehoram. Yehoram was the son of Achav. Achav was the wicked king. In English, he's known as Ahab. And he was the king of the kingdom of Israel. His son was named Yehoram.
Jezebel was his wife.
Jezebel was the wife of Achav. Right. So Jezebel was the wife who was the wife of Achav, and whose son was Yehoram. And at that point, a major threat was the king of Moab, and the kingdom of Israel aligned with the king of the Jewish people, whose name was Yehoshaphat. The king, when I say, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say the Jewish people, the king of of Judah, the two tribes, and Yehoshaphat. So Yehoram and Yehoshaphat both felt threatened by Moab, and they said, let's go to war together against Moab. All right, again, you can look in Malachim 2, chapter 11, you'll see more about this. So you have these two kings who joined together for war, and they traveled now to go to war for 7 days in the desert. And they could not find any water, not for themselves, not for their animals, not for their army or for the animals. And therefore they thought, maybe this is going to be our downfall. Maybe without water, we're not going to survive. So it's in this moment where they didn't know what to do, where someone posed the question. Yehoshaphat, who was righteous, I believe Yehoshaphat was one of the righteous kings of Judah. So he says, is there among us a prophet of God? And the word is, is there among us a prophet we can turn to for guidance into whether we should continue forward in the battle against Moab or maybe we should retreat? And it's in response to his question in that moment where the verse was said, yes, there is a prophet. Po, again, right from the pasuk. Po Yehoshaphat ben Elisha ben Shaphat, asher yatzak ma'amad Eliyahu. Yes, there is a great prophet who can assist us in this time, and his name is Elisha. And if you want to know what makes him so special, he poured water for Eliyahu. So now we have the context of this verse. But now, what is the context of the pouring of the water? That seems to be a strange, even if he was an assistant to Eliyahu, why reference that, pouring water? What is the story of the pouring water? So the answer is that this, according to Rashi at least, Rashi says this pouring water wasn't just any pouring water. This is not talking about that he was thirsty in the middle of a meal and he gave him water. Maybe he did, but that's not what this is referring to. This is referring to a very miraculous pouring of water. And for this, I challenge you. Where was there a miraculous pouring of water during the lifetime of Eliyahu Hanavi? What's that? Har Carmel. That didn't take long. Mount Carmel. In the story of Mount Carmel.
I want to make sure we get to what the question was in your WhatsApp.
So the story. I don't even,
Mazel tov.
in the story of Mount Carmel, we have that Eliyahu Hanavi goes to battle against the Nevi'ei Baal, the prophets of the Baal, and they have a very interesting face-off in which maybe we should do this Gemara one day, in which we have the Nevi'ei Baal, the 400 prophets of the idol Baal, bring a sacrifice facing off against Elijah. Eliyahu Hanavi bring a sacrifice, and what in the process of how the sacrifice was brought of Eliyahu Hanavi, which concluded with a fire descending from heaven and swallowing up the sacrifice and the altar and everything else, Elijah begins with, he commanded, let's pour water, soak the altar and the sacrifice with water, this thereby enhancing the miracle that took place afterwards, where the fire consumed everything, including the water. So Rashi says that when they said to Yehoshaphat, here is a prophet whose name is Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who poured water for Eliyahu Hanavi, they were saying he was the one who poured the water in that episode. So that's the significance of the pouring of water, which is described in this verse. The bottom line that the Gemara is trying to say, though, is that ultimately the being an assistant, the pouring of water that he did for Eliyahu Hanavi was a greater compliment to him than saying he spent years dedicated to study under Eliyahu Hanavi. All right, very good.
But that's actually, you can say that it shows, it not necessarily shows that he was Meshamesh. He was able to do something that helped the miracle.
Which was miraculous.
Yeah, so it's not like you put a spot.
Right. You're saying maybe now that we have the context of the pouring of water, we can appreciate it. We can appreciate why they said that. But some of the Mepharshim say that the greater point over here is that it doesn't say Asher Lama the Asher Yatzak. It could have said both, because this is Elisha, who studied from Eliyahu and who poured the water. The fact that it didn't even find it necessary to mention the studying is part of the proof that this is that really it was his assistance. The fact that he was able, that Eliyahu Navi chose him and to assist him in this miracle is what's the greater example. By the way, how did that story end with the kings? So what happens? They say, here's Elisha. Now what? What happens next? So what happens next is another miraculous episode in which Elisha tells them, in the name of Hashem, the words are, Lo tiru ruach, you won't see a wind, V'lo tiru geshem, and you won't see rain, V'hanachal hahu, but the river that's in front of you, Yimali mayim, will fill with water, Ushasisem atem u'meklechem be'emtenchem, and you and your soldiers and your animals will drink, V'nekel be'inei Hashem, V'nasan es Moav b'yedchem, and it'll be good in the eyes of Hashem, and God will give Moav into your hands. So that's how that story ends. All right, let's move on to the Gemara. And now we're going to really, I guess, make a left turn to something brand new. But as we're going to see, this is also the connection between the following statement and the previous one was the author. This too is a wisdom from Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We're now at the bottom three lines of the Zayin Amud Beis, 7b. Rabbi Yitzchak said to Rabbi Nachman, he was talking to Rabbi Nachman, he said, my time Allah asimar labei knishtal etzlui. He says, where were you? Where were you at Minyan yesterday? We don't see you in shul. It's an age-old question. Why don't I see you at shul for davening? What's the oh my goodness, how does it go? All right, I forget. All right, anyway, so let's think about the Secret Service or something. Anyways, all right. In my time, he says, why is it that I don't see you in shul for davening? So Rav Nachman responded, Lo yachilna. I can't. I'm weak. I'm weak and I'm unable to come to shul. Okay. But for some rabbis, that would be enough. But not Rav Yitzchak. He didn't let him off the hook like that. He says, okay, if you're weak and you're unable to go to shul, likanfi lemar asara v'litzli. So why don't you arrange 10 people to come to your house? and daven that way. You have to daven with a minyan. So if you're weak that you can't go to shul, fine. So then arrange for 10 people to come to your house to daven with a minyan. Amar le, so he answered, Tricha li milsa. It is difficult for me. Now, there's actually two understandings of Tricha li milsa. One understanding is that he said, it's just very difficult for me to rustle up 10 friends to come to my house, to daven every day, Shachris ben Chamayr, morning, afternoon, evening. A second explanation is that he didn't mean to say it's difficult for me, but he meant to say, I don't want to be a burden on the community. I become a burden on others. Yes, for me, it would be easy to, send out messages and get people to come, but I don't want to become a burden to others. And therefore, I prefer to daven at home alone than to be a burden to others and ask people to come to my house. Okay? So he says to him, V'lema leimar. So he said, okay, I understand why you can't come to shul. I also understand why you don't have a minyan come to your house. He says, but there's still something else you should do. And the following is very practical. He says, you should tell Lema Leimar L'shlucha de Tzibura. You should tell the chazan, the shliach tzibur, the idna de matzli tzibura leisei v'loyde lema. You should at least, what you should have to do is that the chazan, the one who leads the services, should notify you when the community is davening. At least for that, they should notify you when the community is davening, and you should daven at the same time that the community davens. Amar le. So Rabbi Nachman heard this and says, "My kuli hai. Why is this significant? And as I'm not davening in shul, and I'm not having a minyan in my house, why does it matter when the community is davening? I should daven if I'm anyways at home. I may as well daven at my own convenience." He says no. He says Amar le. So Rabbi Yitzchak now responded. And this again links us to the previous Talmud. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. I'm now going to 8a in the Gemara Brachas. My dichsiv. What is the meaning of the pasuk? And this is a pasuk in Tehillim, Psalms, chapter 69, verse number 14. Va'ani tifilasi. David HaMelech says, and I, my prayer. Those words also deserve its own discussion, but for a different time and place. He says, I and my prayer, says David HaMelech, L'cha Hashem, to you, God, Eis Ratzon, should be in a desirable time. So David HaMelech says, and I, my prayer should be to you in a desirable time. What does that mean? What is the meaning of a desirable time? Since when is there a right and wrong time to pray? Prayer is always good. So the Gemara says, what does it mean? So David HaMelech clearly is alluding to the fact that there are times that are better to daven than others. What's that? Right, so Bilam was looking for a very specific moment to capitalize on God's anger, like a specific instant in time. But David HaMelech was talking, I guess, more broader, that he's beseeching from God that my prayer should be for you in a Eis Ratzon, in a good time. Interestingly, we talk about Eis Ratzon is something else similar to this is, what's the lashon? The pasuk Karov. Is a pasuk which describes God's closeness. What's the pasuk? Anyways, it says that there's a time which God is close, and the sages tell us that's referring to. No, something else. There's a time that God is close. No, and the sages say it's referring to the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I don't know why that pasuk is slipping in my mind right now. The time says pray to God when He is close, and that time is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But here's something else. Aside for, Dirshu Hashem b'himatza kru'u b'yosakarav. That's what. Dirshu Hashem b'himatza kru'u b'yosakarav. Search out God when He is nearby. Reach out to Him when He is close. So that's referring to, it says, the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But here you have something else. David HaMelech says, "V'ani tefilasi," and I, my prayer, L'cha Hashem Eis Ratzon, should be in the right time. Says the Gemara, Emasai Eis Ratzon. What is the time that is Eis Ratzon? B'sha'a she'hatzibur mispalel. The time that the congregation davens. The time that the local congregation davens is the time that is considered to be a good time to pray. So even if you're home and you can't make it to shul, you should find out when your local synagogue is davening, and you should daven at that time. Now it helps in Crown Heights. You have prayers around the clock. Some cities, you have enough Jews that there's prayers around the clock, so you can say, whenever I daven, I'll be aligned with one of the nearby shuls. But in general, the shul that you belong to, the shul that's close to you is the one that and most people don't think of this. You think if I'm home, okay, I'll daven. But the idea of aligning your prayer with the prayer of the congregation. Not only that, but if you look at this pasuk, the commentaries point out that David HaMelech is referring to his personal prayer. You may say, okay, maybe it's true that God is found at the time of the congregation davens, but maybe that's only where the congregation is davening as well. Maybe you have to be with them. But the wording of the pasuk is David HaMelech referring to his personal prayer. Va'ani tifilasi. He's talking about his personal, almost his personal private prayer. And the fact that he talks about his personal prayer being linked to an Eis Ratzon, to the right time, you can derive from this idea that even an individual who's davening, if they do it alongside at the same time as the minyan of the congregation, they are accessing the special time, the Eis Ratzon, the time of desire for prayer.
There are Zoom phones, like when the minyan is, they do like a Zoom video that people can join. And also, I think you can answer the Kaddish.
So that's a good question. Can you answer Kaddish and Kedusha and Amen? I don't know. There's a difference between Amen, which is, I think, a more flexible to say Amen. Amen just means I agree. With answering to things like Kedusha, I believe that you can't respond to Kedusha unless you're in the presence of a minyan. Halachic. With that, you cannot which? Kedusha. Because Kedusha needs a minyan. But Amen is there's more, Amen is a lesser.
For Amen, I think he even says it's not supposed to.
Really?
Yeah, because it's not the same sound that the person made. It's like distorted over audio.
Interesting. Interesting.
It's with microphone, it's all kind of things. Like if you have a big crowd and somebody say with microphone, it's also a problem.
Well, it depends on the question about a microphone, depends on the necessity of the obligation. If I'm answering Amen to someone's bracha, my Amen he doesn't need my Amen to say his bracha. Right? If someone says a bracha, he doesn't need my Amen in most situations, or many situations. My Amen, whether I say it or not, it's on me to say Amen. If I don't say it, that person still says the bracha. There are situations where the bracha requires 10 people. Right, Shomei Kona, but there's some situations I need that. Like, for example, if I am whenever I need a minyan to daven, whenever I need a minyan to do like the benching, we add some words in the benching when there's a minyan. So for that, I need 10 people. So if I actually need 10 people to say the words I'm saying, then it can't be with the microphone. They have to hear my voice. Like the blessing of Kiddushin under the chuppah. It's just something that came up recently. When you say when the rabbi says the bracha of the Kiddushin under the chuppah, it should not be. There should be 10 people hearing him without the microphone. Some people actually turn away the microphone during that bracha. Right. Anyway. Okay, so all right, the Gemara then continues with other sources of this idea that there's a certain holiness at the time that the people pray. So as it turns out that there is a holiness to the location of prayer, even if the people are not davening then. So if I can choose to daven in a shul, even if I'm not davening at the time others are davening, or maybe this is a shul which doesn't have a minyan that day, or it doesn't have a minyan that evening. So there is a holiness to the location, and therefore it is better to daven inside a shul than to daven anywhere else. If I can make it to a shul, even if there's no minyan, then there's also a holiness to the time that the minyan davens in shul, even if I'm not there. So the holiness to the location without the minyan, and there's the holiness to the time of the minyan, even if I'm not in that location. Fine. The Gemara then continues with several lines, which several sources, different psukim, different verses, in which extol the value of the prayer of the congregation. Again, so much so that even if I'm not with them, I should try to daven at the same time as them. And then the Gemara shares an interesting halacha. Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, Kol mi sheyesh lo beis hakneses be'ira. Anyone who has Oh, actually, I thought I was going to get to something else, but I'll say this anyway. Anybody has a shul in their city, and doesn't go there. If you have a shul and you don't enter that shul, go into that shul to daven. Nikra shachen ra is called a bad neighbor. Bad neighbor. What is the meaning of this? So, what's the meaning of being a bad neighbor? In other words, again, here you have different commentaries give different explanations, but one explanation is that shul is like God's home, right? It's the house of God, and when you don't go visit your neighbor, and it says the commentaries say a good neighbor from time to time visits his neighbor and says, "Hello, how are you?" But if you have God in the neighborhood and you don't visit the shul, if you don't go into God's home, you're a bad neighbor. God says, I'm inviting you to my party. I invite you every day, twice a day, actually. And you don't show up. So then you're called a bad neighbor. Fine.
I'm over for food. Conversation.
All right. So this statement doesn't say. It just says anybody who has a shul and doesn't go there to daven. How often that means? I mean, we know you're supposed to go to shul as much as possible, but the actual statement over here doesn't. What's that? I don't think it means you have to go to every shul. In fact, the Jewish tradition is the shul you go to and the shul you don't step foot in. That's an old Jewish tradition. But but certainly the wording. I'm just saying the wording. The wording is anybody has a shul in their city and doesn't go into it. Can you derive from that every shul? I don't know. I think as long as you go to a shul, then you're telling God, I'm visiting your home. I don't want to be a bad neighbor. And to be a really nice neighbor, you should invite God into your home too. All right, that the Gemara doesn't say. That's a little addition there. Weiter. All right, so now here's the halacha which I meant to share earlier. And that is the Gemara says. So a couple of things before I get to the halacha. Another interesting thing. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said they told Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said the following. Ika sabe bebavel. The Rabbi Yochanan was told. Rabbi Yochanan was told there are very old people in Bavel. People live to a ripe old age in Bavel, and he was surprised at that. Tama. He really was surprised at the fact that there were very old people in Bavel. Bavel is Babylonia, which is modern day Iraq. He was in Israel. He was told there are old people in Bavel, and he was surprised at that. Why? The Amar, he said, why? The verse states, and we say this in the davening every day. It says, "Lama'an yirbu yemechem v'yimei benechem al ha'adama," so that you will live long lives, and your children will live long lives al ha'adama, on the land that I have given you. So this is the verse seems to indicate that long life is a blessing for the land of Israel. So how is it that in Bavel people are living long lives? But so what? By what do they merit long life outside of Israel? And so he was curious as to how they live long lives. However, once he was told that they wake up early and go to shul early in the morning, and they stay in shul after Ma'ariv late at night, Amar that must be the merit that they have, which causes them to live long life, is the merit of going to shul early in the morning and the merit of staying in shul late at night. And the idea of early and late doesn't mean that you're there from early in the morning to late at night. It means that you're excited about the morning davening, that you don't show up late. You're there early, you're excited, I want to come early. If something's very exciting, you show up before it starts. And so too, something you're very happy about something, you don't leave as soon as you can, you stay late. So the fact that they go early and they stay late, he says, now I understand why they are blessed with long life there as well. Amar Chista, says Rav Chista, La'olam yikanes adam shnei psachim bebeis hakneses. And Chista said, a person, when they go into shul, very interesting halacha, a person should walk 2 doorways into shul. What does that mean, 2 doorways into shul? So the understanding of this, we actually have the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara Bavli, and the Jerusalem Talmud. So it says you should walk 2 doorways into shul. Shul. Says the Gemara, Shnei Psachim Sagla. Do you mean that you should actually walk into 2 doorways? Ela'ema shiur Shnei Psachim. Rather read it, you should go the amount of space of 2 doorways. which the Gemara says is 8 amos, 8 cubits, which is approximately 12 feet. That a person, when they walk into shul, should walk in 12 feet and only then start daven. So you actually should not walk in and stand right by the doorway and daven, but rather walk in 8 cubits, let's say approximately 12 feet. What's the logic of this? What's the reasoning of walking 12 feet into the synagogue? So what could be the explanation for this? So several explanations are given. One is that if you go in and at the doorway you daven, it's almost like, I don't really appreciate this place. I'm going to go to the entrance. I'll just go in for a second, and then I will, and then I'll daven. The idea of going into something, you say, is that I value this place. I'm not looking to rush in and rush out, but rather I'm spending time here. I'm looking to go in. By the way, interestingly, some of the Shulchan Aruch talks about having a designated seat in a shul, and says if my designated seat happens to be a few feet away from the entrance, that's fine. No, it's only if you don't have a designated seat. Because nowadays we have designated seats, which is its own subject in the shuls, having a designated seat. But then if you have a designated seat, that's all that matters. So then you're fine. But it says the idea of going in 12 feet or so, the amount of 2 doorways. Another explanation given is that go in, and when you're so close to the doorway, you could be distracted by the door. Well, what's going on outside? But if you move in a little bit further, you're not going to be distracted. Okay. Now this is the Gemara Babel, and it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. By the way, it's brought down this idea of walking in the amount of 2 doorways. And the Talmud Yerushalmi says, sorry, I just want to share something. Where did I see it over here? Another idea which is given by the Babli is don't immediately start davening. When you walk into shul, first gather your thoughts and then start davening. Which is, and it's not about the space, it's about the amount of time. That gather your thoughts. This is a way to prepare yourself for davening. You run in, you daven, so by gathering your thoughts, fine. But I want to get to one idea I saw over here, and I know I still owe the answer to the text. I want to get to one idea which I saw about this. I think is very beautiful. This is a more Hasidic explanation of this idea. Because according to the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud actually translates this idea that you actually should go through 2 doorways. That it's not just saying the amount of 2 doorways, but literally a person should walk through 2 doorways before they start praying. Some shuls have it that way. Our shul does. You walk to the outside entrance, and then you come to the sanctuary. Most shuls I do. There are some which don't. You go to Brooklyn, sometimes you walk in the door from outside, is the door into the synagogue. Fine, into the sanctuary. But what's the idea of walking through 2 doorways? So a Chassidic explanation is, which I saw, which I think is very beautiful. He says the first doorway metaphorically means that you've left the outside. There's 2 in life. You could say there's 2 doorways. The first doorway is that you have to leave the chutz, the outside world, behind. You go into davening. The first step is to remove your connection to the outside world. Right now, the outside world is all sorts of, not necessarily bad things, but all sorts of distractions and animalistic pursuits. So the first step is you walk into that first doorway to remove yourself from the outside world. And then doorway number 2 allows you to enter into the presence of Hashem. And there's 2 different steps which one has to take before they daven. First, you leave the outside world. That's doorway number 1, is separate you from the outside. And then doorway number 2 says, now you say, okay, now that I've kind of removed the distractions, I've removed the outside world from my conscience, now I am ready to walk into the presence of the Almighty and really embrace, which was what davening is, which is an intimate conversation with God. And that's the way the Nesivos Salom explains this Gemara. I think a beautiful idea and something to think about. This idea of the mystical idea behind the 2 doorways before davening. And finally, and I'll say this, and I think what I'm going to do is I'll say this today, and we'll explain it more next week. But this is the response to the text. Oh, that's a good point. Next class, I should say. We'll see next week, maybe not. Anyway, but the class is like, the Gemara says like this. The pasuk says, this is a pasuk in Tehillim chapter 32, verse number 6. Says the pasuk, Al zos yispalel kol chassid. This is something that every chassid should daven for. Al zos, for this. Every chassid should daven for. Elecha, to you, God, le'es mitzo, for the time that it will be found. Somewhat cryptic. That every chassid davens for the time that it will be found. Says Gemara, what is that? What is it that a person should pray for that should happen at the time that it'll happen. Some sort of something that we should pray for that should happen well. Amar Chanina, and it says Le'es mitzozu isha, that that a person should pray for, that which will be found, is referring to the wife. That a person should pray that they should find the right wife. Why do we know? Where is the idea of finding associated with a wife? The pasuk says, "Shenemar matzah isha matzah tov." The pasuk says, "Matzah isha," one who found a woman has found good. Matzah isha matzah tov, one who has found a woman has found good. So now here comes what I alluded to in the text. B'ma'arava, in the west. What is the west referring to? Israel, right? Because this is the Gemara is in Babylonia. What is west of Babylonia? What is west of Iraq? Is Israel. B'ma'arava, in Israel, kinasiv inish itza. When a man marries a woman, amri lehachi, at the wedding, there's this dance, and they say the following to him: matzah o motza. Was it matzah or was it motza? Now, both matzah and motza is connected to finding. It's just slightly different variations of the word finding. And they would tell a groom, was it matzah or was it motza? Did you find or did you find? What's the meaning of that verse? What is the meaning of that song? Matzah or motza? So the Gemara says like this. The meaning of the question was, matzah is a reference to the goodness of finding a woman, where it says, matzah isha matzah tov yafik ratzon Hashem. One who found a woman found good and is desirable for Hashem. Motza, however, the word motza is a reference to a verse which is said by King Solomon. Viewer discretion advised. And the verse is, Umotza ani mar mi maves esa isha. And I have found more bitter than death the woman who you have given me. And that's a statement by Shlomo Melech, who had 1,000 wives, by the way. So you have two verses. One which says that finding a woman is finding good. All that is good can be found in the Isha, the woman that one found. The other, which is Motza, is Shlomo Melech complaining that the woman he found was very bitter. So therefore, this wedding song, they turn to the groom and they say, tell us, was it matzah or motza? Which is it? Is it matzah isha matzah tov? Or would you say that it was motza, which is a reference to the bitterness of King Solomon? And I think we're going to leave off with the question is, what exactly is the value of such a song? You know, what exactly is the depth to such a statement? What possible positive message? And what is the chassan supposed to answer? You know, is he on video, matzah or motza? So what is there must be deeper ideas behind this. And as the commentaries say, there must be a deeper message of wisdom and even musar and sort of guidance that's being given. It's not just a cute song. It's certainly not it's not just for the sake of a joke. There must be something deeper to the matzah or motza song that they sang in the West, in Israel in that time. And I don't know if you want to try to incorporate that in today's weddings, up to you. But next time we study together, we'll go to the deeper understanding of the matzah versus motza song that took place in the weddings in the West. I don't know. That's a good question. We have to go to that matzah. If you want to know that verse of Shlomo Melech where he says that, it's in Kohelet, chapter 7, verse number 26. So I'm sure the commentary is there. And we know Shlomo Melech, one of his mistakes is that this was considered a mistake of Shlomo Melech. He took too many wives. So what's that? No, well, the two doorways, yes.
Yeah. Now you know this. Is that coincidence that it says no
Aha. Very good. All right. Right. He also taught us Eshes Chal. He said Shir Hashirim is Shlomo Melech. Shlomo Melech gave us the most beautiful descriptions of husband and wife.